Hey guys, Zack here, and this is my review of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Okay, so this episode is interesting. So it is in fact more or less the end of the story. It's where the boss is finally defeated, but it also sets up another arc that is a flashback, but also kind of interesting because it kind of sets up a thing at the end that implies some things with Bucciardi, but I don't fully understand what yet, but it is interesting. But in case the episode does open up with a flashback where we do see all of the gang before they met Giorno all together, and they're currently eating at their usual spot when Mista out of the blue suddenly remarks that whether or not they would think that cannibalism is actually if eating human meat would actually taste good or not, and of course everybody yells at him to not say those kinds of things while they're eating. But put a pin in that because I will get to it. But in case it goes back, it does. Then we then see a Sparrow that just transitions us from the past back to the present, and we then see Gold Experience Requiem fighting off King Crimson, and despite the boss's best efforts, he's unable to actually land a hit on Giorno or Gold Experience Requiem, and Gold Experience Requiem merely tells him that so long as that no matter how hard he fights, he will never be able to arrive at his truth, and then proceeds to finish him off and sends him flying into the Tiber River. And of course both Mista and Trish celebrate, pointing out that obviously this means that they finally finished the boss and that they're finally victorious. And of course Mista is very happy about the fact that they've finally taken down the boss, and that means that they can finally take over the organization and stop the drug trade that's happening that's happening throughout Italy. But then Trish points out that something doesn't seem quite right, and points out that it seems that Diavolo's body has just disappeared, and she can sense that he's alive, so she and begins panicking because she realizes that it's possible that her father might actually escape somehow. But what we find out is that no, she doesn't have to worry about any of that, and Giorno just keeps silent. He doesn't really go explain anything about that. But we then actually switch to Diavolo's perspective, and we actually find out why Giorno isn't particularly worried about the boss. So as Trish predicted, Diavolo's body did wind up just washing down the Tiber River, and he winds up clinging onto a sewer opening. And he points out that he's very lucky to have survived, and points out that he has no strength left, and decides that for the time being he's going to crawl into the sewer and nurse his wounds. So he climbs back inside and then starts laughing to himself when he realizes he's finally escaped and has finally managed to get away from Giorno and his crew. And of course he crawls into the sewer and sits down to take a breather when suddenly out of nowhere a vagrant that's living in the sewer and also a little bit crazy because of drugs that are down there. He goes crazy. But this crazy little man just runs up out of nowhere, stabs Diavolo, and what we find out is that this man is just completely gone. He's just so completely insane that he's very much determined to protect his quote unquote special coat. Which he's just carrying around a coat that he apparently thinks is like some sort of magical thing. So he's just running around defending it from other people, and it's implied that he may have killed some of the other homeless people that were living in the sewer, because we see two other people that are asleep and we don't actually see them moving, but it's possible they've been killed. And Diavolo, it eventually registers to Diavolo that he's just been stabbed by a homeless man, and he starts convulsing on the ground once he realizes he's bleeding out, and he starts convulsing on the ground and points out that he's not going to die here because he's Diavolo, and he's determined to not die there, especially to a random vagrant, because he very much believes that he's still very much on top of the world, and he points out that he's not going to let someone of his standing die to a vagrant. But then the man goes to plunge his knife into Diavolo's head, and then he suddenly is warped to a hospital room. And And of course, Diavolo has no idea how he got there. He's just looking around and is just wondering why he's lying on a bed and talking to himself. And of course, he starts looking around when suddenly a woman, or a doctor named Monica Othello, walks in and is cataloging the whole thing. And what we find out is that Diavolo was actually killed by the vagrant in the sewer. He was found in the sewer. He died. And of course she's come to actually determine the cause of death. And Diavolo is hollering at her because he's pointing out if she can hear him and was wondering what's going on. But then it quickly becomes apparent that she means to dissect him and figure out his cause of death. And he of course does eventually figure that out and starts panicking a little bit. And and of course she then starts cutting into him while he's very much alive, and he cannot move because technically speaking he should be dead, but he's not. So effectively she starts digging into him to determine his cause of death, and what we do find out is that he was stabbed by the vagrant in the liver, and that's what killed him. And of course we find out that it wasn't suicide because she notes that there was no signs of hesitation. And of course she then starts picking him apart, and Diavolo, still very much alive through all of this and unable to move or defend himself, starts screaming and panicking, and eventually we get another warp where he suddenly appears in a crowded city with no real memory of how he got there. And of course he starts trying to figure out what exactly it is that's going on. And he does start lodging out what exactly it is that's happening to him. He starts pointing out that he does very much remember being knocked into the Tiber River and then in the hospital room and getting stabbed by the vagrant, but points out that doesn't seem to be what happened to him. He seems to have appeared. He seems to have just appeared in the city, but completely randomly, and starts trying to logic out what exactly Gold Experience Requiem actually did to him. And of course, he points out that obviously he did see the prediction of him winning coming true, but it never did. So he's very confused as to what exactly is going on. And at which point a man and his dog approach him, asking if he's all right, because obviously Diavolo seems very shaken up. But then the dog winds up barking at him, which causes Diavolo to panic, and he winds up tripping over the curb in a very Looney Tunes fashion, and just falls into the road. And he even comments on the fact that this way of dying is actually very silly. And then he finally figures out what's happening to him. He eventually figures out that this is actually Gold Experience Requiem's ability, as he's run over by a car. And of course, it's at this point where as Mista and Trish are actually still trying to find the boss's body. Giorno then finally decides to actually explain to them what exactly is going on. He then proceeds to explain how Diavolo will actually never arrive at is actually alive, but also isn't alive. He proceeds to explain that though Trish senses him as being alive, the fact of the matter is that Gold Experience Requiem has effectively eliminated him from the equation completely. The way he explains is that it effectively points out that he will never actually arrive at the truth of his own death, and he will never truly know how he died. And explains that essentially not having an end is his end. Essentially, he will just keep constantly dying in an infinite loop, unable to do anything about it, and is currently stuck in a time loop where he's unable to do anything to prevent his own death. And of course, off screen, we do see this does continue happening, where Diavolo just keeps dying over and over, and eventually it gets to the point where a little girl approaches him trying to ask him if he's okay, and he winds up sobbing like a baby. So, yeah, Diavolo is effectively eliminated, and while he's still very much alive, he can't really do much except exist. He's constantly stuck in a death loop where he dies, is then reincarnated as himself, and then keeps just constantly dying, and for potentially forever. He's most definitely never coming back. But in case when Trish and Mista hear that and realize that Giorno knows that Giorno has effectively eliminated the boss, they proceed to celebrate and point out that that's obviously a very big accomplishment because they finally won. And Mista decides that now all they need to do is go to the Colosseum and revive Bucciardi, pointing out that obviously his soul should have been warped back to his body, and and that all they need to do is heal his wounds so that he survives. But of course, what we find out is that Giorno knows better. He knows that there's nobody in that body. He knows that Bruciardi has long since passed. But and merely tells them that he'll be a couple of minutes, but then he'll be right behind them. He doesn't really. He waits for them to go and figure it out for themselves. And it's at this point where Giorno actually hears Diavolo, where Giorno actually hears Bruciardi speaking to him, pointing out that that's actually for the best, pointing out that obviously it's better if they find out for themselves, but does point out that ultimately their victory means that they've actually freed fate itself, referring to it as a sleeping slave, and that they have set that slave free, and tells them that ultimately the victory means that now fate can continue to run as it's meant to be run, and not in accordance with Diavolo or anybody else. And then Bruno's spirit disappears alongside Narancia's and Abbacchio's, and they then proceed to depart for heaven. And then Giorno hears a tinkling at his feet, and he looks down to discover that the arrow is currently sitting at his feet. So it's implied that Gold Experience Requiem did its job and then faded. It's not explicitly stated, but considering the fact that the arrow was absorbed into it, it's heavily implied. And now if Giorno ever needs to use Gold Experience Requiem again, he can. He can just pick up the arrow, resummon Gold Experience Requiem, and become more powerful again if he ever needs it. Of course, he's probably not going to just use it with reckless abandon, because obviously it is probably one of the most powerful stands in the entire series. But if the option is there, if he needs it, so. Yeah, but in any case, he then proceeds to leave to go to the Colosseum to go and revive Bruciardi, even though he knows Bruciardi is long dead. At which point we then go back to the flashback from the start of the episode, where Mista then proceeds to explain his whole cannibalism theory. He then proceeds to go on to explain how obviously he points out that a lot of the animals that are considered taboo to eat, namely cats, because Mista brings it up. But he points out that all the animals that are taboo to eat are actually pointing out they're carnivores, and that they actually do taste bad to eat. And of course, Narancia does yell at Mista, pointing out that obviously he wouldn't eat a cat if he absolutely was told it was a delicacy. And of course, Mista points out that that's exactly his point. But then he also points to a species of fish called sweet fish, which, as he explains, eat algae. And despite fish guts normally tasting terrible, sweet fish guts actually taste not that bad, and that they actually taste pretty good. And he also proceeds to extend that logic to a bunch of other animals that are okay to eat, because as he points out, all the animals that we consider okay to eat are all herbivores. They eat plants, not meat. And he does point out that because they eat plants, he points out that obviously we eat things that actually taste like that actually eat plants, and that's what makes them taste good. And he then proceeds to point out that because humans are omnivores, and that they actually, and carnivores specifically, because they eat meat. He points out that that's the reason why cannibalism is taboo, because we obviously probably wouldn't taste very good. According to Mista's logic, and of course Abbacchio points out that actually is pretty sound logic, and he can't find any faults in it, and does point out that that's actually a pretty good reasoning to come to. But then Narancia adds to that by pointing out that obviously he eats a lot more. He's a vegetarian and eats a lot more plants than he does meat, and Mista cites that maybe he'll actually taste good. At which point Fugo decides to stop the whole conversation, telling Mista to knock it off and telling Narancia to stop egging him on. So Fugo just kind of puts an end to that conversation. At which point, Bruciardi walks in, revealing that this is actually set well before Leaky Eye Luca, around the time Leaky Eye Luca was murdered. He actually died when Luca died at the start of the series. That is what prompted this investigation, and of course it's revealed that, and of course it is implied that this is actually the moment where Giorno's introduced to the rest of the group. But Of course, this is this point. Of course, Narancha points out that he actually didn't like Leaky Eye Luca, pointing out that not only was he a bit too brutal for his own good, but he was also kind of an asshole, and he also gave drugs to kids. And points out he wouldn't be surprised if he accidentally killed himself by accident, by just falling on his ass, by just kind of getting high, falling on his ass, and then killing himself that way. And of course, it's at this point where Bruno tells Narancha not to say those kinds of things, pointing out that obviously this is the kind of world they live in, and that he should take things a little bit more seriously, and there's a possibility that he could have been murdered. At which point Fugo gets up and volunteers to do the investigation for Bucciardi, pointing out that he's going to be Kappa one day, and that he shouldn't be worrying himself with these kind of things. But Bucciardi points out that it's fine, and that he's more than happy to look into it himself. At which point Fugo decides to tell Bucciardi that he actually has a visitor. And of course, what we find out is that this visitor is actually a florist, and what we find out is that that he's disabled. He's unable to really walk all that well. But he came to meet Bucciardi, and also tells him that he actually has a. What is it? He actually lost his only daughter very recently, which of course it's at this point where the man actually walks in, and the first thing Bucciardi actually asks him is if he pays his taxes, and of course the man is openly confused, but points out that obviously that Bucciardi then proceeds to explain his reasoning, pointing out that obviously he seems like the responsible kind of guy who would pay his taxes and would actually pay what he owes to the country. And points out that obviously this is not the kind of business he should be dealing with and associating with, and points out that if he's not careful, he could very well easily be owing a lot more than what he normally pays in taxes to the organization, and that's likely something he's not going to be paying off anytime soon. And of course the man finally understands and proceeds to explain how he's just a responsible husband, father, and business owner. He explains how he pays his taxes. He tried to do right to by his only daughter, and explains how he very much puts in his 9 to 5 and makes sure that he is able to provide for his family. But then he actually starts sobbing and pointing out about his daughter, and then asks Bucciardi if he can have a moment of privacy with him. And Bucciardi then proceeds to point out that actually no, he can't. As he proceeds to explain, he trusts his crew and his crew trusts him. And also points out that obviously they're in the middle of eating, so this is not the kind of thing that they can just kind of get up and leave and not doing anything with. But and of course the man, upset about that answer but understanding, then proceeds to explain what exactly it is that he wants from Bucciardi. And then proceeds to go on to explain how his daughter before her death was actually dating a man. She was actually dating a young sculptor. And we kind of sort of meet the sculptor at the end of the episode, but what we find out is that she had been dating the sculptor happily for a couple of months, and then what rubbed her father the wrong way is that the sculptor never once came over to visit the family, which was a bit of cause for concern for him. He never actually met this boyfriend and was very confused about what happened. And then it's at this point where he then proceeds to explain how only like a week ago or so, he then proceeds to explain that after dating her boyfriend for several months, she suddenly appeared on the roof of his apartment building with a strange looking rock and then proceeded to fall off of his apartment building and die. And of course he proceeds to start sobbing hysterically but then proceeds to point out that obviously he then proceeds to explain what exactly the thing he wants from Bucciardi is, and then proceeds to pull out a large bag of cash and explains that he wants revenge for his daughter, which of course Bucciardi is very on the fence about, pointing out that obviously they are not hitmen, they're not there to assassinate somebody. And proceeds to point out that he points out that he's not going to hurt somebody, and of course the man proceeds to explain that the reason he's saying this is because he believes that the sculptor is the one responsible. He believes since his daughter was found with a strange looking rock that seemingly came from the sculptor, And he believes that the sculptor pushed her off the roof and wants revenge for that. And of course Bouchardi once again points out that they are not hitmen, and proceeds to wonder why he would actually come to the organization in the first place, pointing out that obviously he could go through the police or anybody else if he believes that it was a murder-suicide attempt. But of course the man proceeds to explain that he went to the police and proceeded to explain how for a while now he's been trying to explain to the police what actually happened, but the police and even the man's lawyer, even the florist's lawyer, ruled it as a suicide. They did not believe that he was actually that the sculptor actually did it. Even though the florist then proceeds to point out that obviously he knows something, that he and his wife know something about his daughter that the police obviously didn't really consider, which is that the woman wouldn't have committed suicide because he knows his daughter very well. He points out that she's not the kind of person to commit suicide, so he points out that the sculptor obviously had to have something to do with it. And it's at this point where Bouchardi realizes why the conversation would have gotten awkward. And realizes now why the florist wanted to meet in private, because obviously this is a big thing to claim, and obviously points out that though they're not going to get revenge on his behalf, they do point out that that since the man obviously went to the police, and the police kind of just ruled out the fact that couldn't have been anything other than a suicide. He concludes that actually he's more than happy to look into it, but also points out that he's only going to be taking the money if they can confirm that the guy did in fact did it, and they do in fact get a confession. And of course they then proceed to leave, and of course he then proceeds to tell the group that he's going to send Mista to go and look into it, and of course tells Mista that he needs to get ready to gear up and get ready to go investigate. And Mista then proceeds to get up, but then he notes that there's a strange rock sitting on his chair when he notes it wasn't there to begin with. And of course he then wonders what exactly it is, and then he reaches down to touch the rock, and it's implied that this rock is in fact a stand, because he touches it, and then the words "kill me" appear on his hand, which winds up striking him as very odd. But it's at this point where Baccio points out that Mista needs to be more careful, and it seems that Mista had actually knocked it off of its pedestal inside the restaurant, and when Mista kind of clicks in his head that that's seemingly what happens, he then proceeds to pick up the rock and put it back on its pedestal, and then they leave. At which point Bouchardi, Fugo, and Mista are getting ready to go in the car, and Bouchardi hands Mista a picture of the guy that they're supposed to get a confession from, and tells Mista what his objective is. That he needs to get a confession, but they are not assassins. They are not going to get revenge. They are not going to do a whole bunch of other horrible things without reason. So for that reason, he tells Mista to simply bring a tape recorder or wear a wire or whatever he needs to get the confession, and then bring it back to the man so they can get paid. And of course, Mista does wonder how far they're supposed to go with it, but and again, Bouchardi points out that they are not hitmen. So he merely points out that to satisfy the florist's need for revenge, merely just makes it sure that he can't walk for a while, and then let the police handle the rest of it. So yeah, for those reasons. But with that, he then proceeds to point out that Mista should obviously be fine as long as they don't kill him. They're not supposed to. But he then proceeds to get ready to go in the car when Mista, out of the corner of his eye, suddenly spots the seemingly strange rock again, which he then goes to go check behind the car, and of course both Fugo and Bouchardi are wondering what exactly it is he's doing, and note that he seems to be in a bit of a panic, but he merely responds that he'll be there in a minute, and sure enough, he looks over to see that there's actually an entire pile of rocks, and that some construction guys are actually building a new house, and that they're using the rocks for a foundation and a whole bunch of other things. And satisfied with that, Mista then proceeds to get in the car, and but once he can get in the car and starts driving to the boyfriend's apartment, Mista then proceeds to ask what exactly it is if the man actually explained what the strange stone that he saw that his daughter was holding looked like. And of course points out that obviously he feels like he's been seeing the stone a lot, but it's at this point but of course Bucciardi points out that the man never explained what exactly the stone looked like. That it looked weird. And of course, Mista points out that obviously they're wondering what kind of shape it was, and is trying to kind of logic out the stone that he's been seeing, and sure enough, as he's trying to logic that out, he seemingly sees the stone in the street as they're driving, which of course causes Mista to start panicking, and he tells Fugo to pull over because he feels like he's seeing it. And of course does look out the window to try and find it, but then by that point the stone has completely disappeared, and he wonders if he had just been imagining it. But at that point they arrive at the sculptor's apartment, and Fugo and Bucciardi let him out, and of course Mista goes off to go into doing his investigation, and of course Fugo wonders if it's in fact a smart idea to just let Mista go off on his own, since he's clearly rattled by something. But Bucciardi points out that obviously if it'll make Fugo feel better, he's more than happy to tag along with Mista, and tells Fugo to look into the leaky eye Luca incident, and Fugo then leaves to go and look into that. And of course, it's at this point where they actually start looking for where Mista actually gets ready to go to the man's apartment, and he then proceeds to pull out the name and address that he gave him, and what we find out is that the sculptor is actually named Scopili, and what we find out is that he is in fact a sculptor, and he lives on the 7th floor. So Mista then proceeds to press the elevator button, and then looks out onto the courtyard while he's waiting, and notes that seems to be the place where the woman committed suicide, but does point out he does note that something is a little bit strange about that, and does wonder why exactly she would jump off the roof. At which point the door then proceeds to open. The elevator door proceeds to open, and he then looks, and then not only does he see Scopili hiding inside the elevator, we do somewhat see him, but he is in fact hiding in the elevator. But so I will picture him. But we also find out that he is in fact a stand user, and that the rock that Mista has been seeing is in fact his stand. And of course, this is this point where Mista actually opens fire on the rock to try and get rid of it, and wonder what exactly it is. And as he shoots at it, it starts breaking parts of it away, and what's left is a sculpture of Bucciardi, which of course causes Mista to panic. So yeah, this episode kind of implies something. There's something with Bucciardi that apparently was implied from the very beginning. Apparently, this was a thing that Mista had figured out a long time ago. Apparently, this was a flashback that Mista is going through in his head, and it implies that something strange is going to go on with Bucciardi in the near future. And considering Bucciardi winds up dying, there definitely seems to be some sort of implication with that. But yeah, I'm interested to find out what this stand is and what it actually does, because obviously there's one episode left. They kind of need to explain that, and this is like the final arc that they're going to do. So yeah, I'm interested to see how this is actually going to turn out. But for the time being, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitter in the description below. Be sure to check out my Patreon in the description below as well. It's only a couple bucks a month. It does really help me out. And you guys get access to a bunch of cool perks that are my way saying thanks. I mainly use it to fund myself, but if you got any ideas for what I could do with that, I would be very much appreciated. I'm trying to post the first video of every Let's Play I do, but that obviously doesn't always work. So, yeah, I hope you guys will actually just go and check out my Patreon, and also just go and check out all my other things as well. I've got a throne if you want to suggest gifts for me and a bunch of other things that you think I would like. Just go check those out. Be sure to check out a couple of other things. My Twitch as well. I stream on Sundays. Go check that out. I actually just uploaded an archive for that, so go check that out as well. Yeah, and also if you want to see more content from me, then be sure to check out the videos linked in the end screen. The top video is the most recent video. It may or may not be this one. Whereas the bottom video is the video recommended to you based on what you've already seen from me. So if you want to try something new, or see more of what you like, then be sure to check both of those videos out. But in any case, thank you guys so much for watching. And until next time, we'll see you guys in the next video. Peace!